The night Damien Rourke walked into the Voss estate, he didn't knock. He never knocked. The front doors swung open like they were afraid of him, and the three men who had been standing guard outside were already gone, not dead, just gone, reassigned to the sidewalk like decorations nobody needed anymore. Damien crossed the marble foyer without looking at the chandelier, without looking at the oil portraits lining the walls, without acknowledging a single thing that the Voss family had spent 4 generations building. He sat down in the center of the living room, in the largest chair, uninvited, and when Harold Voss came downstairs in his robe at 2 in the morning, face pale and hands shaking, Damien didn't stand up. He just looked at him. "Sit down, Harold," he said. "We need to talk about what you owe me." If you've ever watched someone's entire life collapse, in a single conversation, not dramatically, not with screaming or fire, but quietly, the way a building settles before it finally gives, then you already know what happened next. And if you haven't, stay with us tonight, because this story is going to get a lot worse before it gets anywhere close to better. Before we go further, if this is your first time here, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bells so you never miss what comes next. These stories don't wait for anyone. Drop a comment below and tell us what city or country you're watching from. We want to know how far this story has traveled. Now like this video, because what Damien Rourke does next is something you are absolutely not ready for. Alara Voss was 29 years old the night she stopped being her father's daughter and became someone else entirely. She didn't know that yet. She was in her bedroom on the 2nd floor, still in the clothes she'd worn to a dinner party she'd left early because her father had texted her 3 words, "Come home now," and Harold Voss was not a man who texted. He made calls. He had assistants make calls on his behalf. The fact that he had typed those words himself, without punctuation, without his usual formal cadence, had made her stomach drop somewhere around the 14th floor elevator of the Langham Hotel. It had not come back up since. She sat on the edge of her bed and listened to the voices downstairs. Couldn't make out the words, just the register. Her father's voice, thinned out and higher than usual, the voice he used when he was cornered in a board meeting and running out of room, and another voice she didn't recognize low, even with the particular flatness of someone who had no interest in being heard, only obeyed. Her sister Nadia was already in the hallway. She was 24 and had their mother's instincts for danger, which meant she was pressed against the wall outside Alara's door, with her arms crossed and her face the color of old milk. "There are men outside," Nadia said. "In the garden." Counted 6. "Who are they?" "I don't know. They're not security. They're not wearing our colors." Nadia looked at her. "Alara, Dad called you, didn't he?" "Not me, you." Alara didn't answer that, because there wasn't a good answer. She moved to the top of the staircase and looked down. The man in the living room was sitting with his back to her, which should have been a relief. It wasn't. There was something deliberate about it, like he already knew exactly where she was, and the choice not to look was itself a kind of power move. He had dark hair cut short, a gray jacket that probably cost more than most people's cars. His hands were folded in his lap, completely still. Harold Voss stood 6 feet away from him, and Harold Voss was a man who had fired people in their 50s without blinking, who had demolished entire companies before breakfast, who had once made a senator cry at a charity gala. And right now, Harold Voss looked like he might sit down on the floor if someone didn't hold him up. "I am offering you a solution," the man said. "That's not something I typically do." "Damien." Harold's voice cracked on the name. Actually cracked. "My family has nothing to do with this. My daughters are. One of them," the man said. "The older one." Alara's hand tightened on the banister. She didn't move. She stood at the top of the stairs and waited, because she had learned a long time ago that in a negotiation, the first person to speak was usually the one who lost. "I don't understand," Harold said, though from the look on his face, he understood perfectly. "The debt is $1.3 billion, Harold. Your banks are frozen. Your accounts in Luxembourg were seized this afternoon." "Yes, I know about those." "You have 4 properties and a portfolio of investments that are currently worth approximately 11 cents on the dollar, because everyone with money in this city already knows you're finished." Damien paused. Not for effect. Just because he had said what he needed to say and saw no reason to add anything. Debt disappears tonight. All of it. I write it off. I clear the creditors, and your family keeps the estate and enough operating capital to rebuild. Your name survives. Harold said nothing. In exchange, Damien continued, I take your daughter as my wife. The room went completely silent. Alara's heartbeat was very loud in her own ears. She thought, clearly and without any particular emotion, that she should be more surprised by this, that the appropriate response was probably shock or outrage, or the kind of disbelief that makes your legs stop working. Instead, she felt something cold and sharp settle into her chest, not fear, exactly. More like recognition. The way you feel when you've been reading a story for a long time, and you finally reached the page where you understand how it was always going to end. She walked down the stairs. She didn't run. She didn't hesitate. She descended at a normal pace, one hand on the rail, and when she reached the bottom and walked into the living room, and Damien Rourke finally turned to look at her, she met his eyes directly and kept her face completely neutral. He was younger than she'd expected, late 30s, maybe 40, face that had been handsome once, before something had rearranged it, not violence, exactly, but a particular kind of sustained pressure that changed the lines of a person over time. He looked at her the way she imagined. Engineers looked at structural problems, assessing, calculating, searching for the weak points. She didn't give him any. I heard you, she said. She looked at her father. Dad, go upstairs. Harold blinked. Eller, go upstairs. I need 5 minutes alone with this man. Something moved across Damien Rourke's face. It was gone before she could name it. He glanced at Harold, once, with the mild patience of someone watching a child, decide whether to argue, and Harold Voss, who had never taken an order in his life in an act, from his own daughter turned him toward the staircase. When his footsteps disappeared, the room was very quiet. Alara sat down in the chair across from Damien. She put both feet flat on the floor and her hands in her lap, and she looked at him directly. Let me understand the terms, she said. The terms are simple. Nothing is simple. Tell me anyway. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, legal marriage. You live under my roof. In exchange, your family's debt is cleared, and they are protected from the other parties who currently have claims on your father's assets. And there are several, some of whom are considerably less polite than I am. A beat. The arrangement can be revisited in 2 years. Revisited meaning divorced. Revisited meaning renegotiated. That's not the same thing. No, he said. It isn't. Alara looked at the fireplace for a moment, thought about the 6 men in the garden. She thought about the look on her father's face. She thought about Nadia upstairs, pressing herself against the wall, and about her mother, who had died 4 years ago, and who had always told her that the Voss family's greatest weakness was their inability to see danger until it was already inside the house. My sister is off limits, she said, in any capacity. She's not part of this arrangement. She's not a secondary negotiating point. She doesn't come into any conversation you have with anyone about my family. She is completely separate. Damien studied her. Agreed. My father keeps his passport and his freedom of movement. He's not a prisoner. He never was. I want that in writing. For the first time, something that was almost a smile moved across his face. Not warmth, it was too controlled for that, but something close to genuine interest. You want a contract? I want clarity, Alara said. If we're doing this, we're doing it with terms that both parties understand and have agreed to. I'm not walking into your house on a handshake. Damien looked at her for another long moment. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a folded document, thick paper, multiple pages, and set it on the coffee table between them. I had it prepared this afternoon, he said. Alara looked at the document. She looked at him. You were that sure I'd agree, she said. That sure your father would. It was the most honest thing he said to her all night, and somehow it made everything worse. She read the contract twice, every page. He didn't rush her. His men stayed outside. No one moved through the house. Damien Rourke sat in his chair and looked at his phone occasionally, with the calm of a man who had nowhere he needed to be, and Alara sat across from him with 47 pages of legal language in her hands and tried to find the trap. There was always a trap. She found 3 clauses she wanted changed. He agreed to 2 of them immediately, and the third after a pause that told her it mattered more than he wanted her to know, which meant she'd been right to push on it. By the time she signed her name at the bottom of the last page, the clock in the foyer said 4:47 in the morning, and her hand was completely steady. "I'll have a car here at noon tomorrow," Damien said, standing. "Pack what you need. I'll pack what I want." He almost smiled again. "Fine." He left through the front door. His men went with him. The garden was empty inside of 30 seconds. Alara sat in the living room alone for a moment, listening to the house settle around her. Then she heard footsteps on the stairs, and her father appeared in the doorway, still in his robe, his face so careful blank that she knew he'd been listening from the landing the whole time. "Alara," he said. "Don't," she said quietly. She wasn't angry. She didn't have the energy for anger yet, and somewhere underneath the exhaustion she knew that if she started, she might not stop. "Not tonight, Dad." Harold Voss closed his mouth. She went upstairs, and she sat on the edge of her bed, and she stared at the window until dawn came through it. She did not sleep. She spent the hours between 5 and 11 making lists, not because she was a list person, but because her brain needed somewhere to put the noise she was walking into, what she actually knew about Damien Rourke versus what she'd heard, what her leverage was, if she had any. What she knew was this: Damien Rourke had inherited the Rourke organization from his father at 26. After his father's death, under circumstances that were officially ruled a heart attack and subject of about 15 different theories, none of them provable. He had spent the following 12 years systematically dismantling or absorbing every rival operation within a 300-mile radius. Not through open warfare, that was the interesting part, but through a combination of financial pressure, strategic alliance, and the occasional very targeted disappearance of people who couldn't be reasoned with. He was not impulsive. He was not emotional. He was not the kind of man who made decisions at 4 in the morning, because something moved him in the moment, which meant the marriage was not impulse, which meant she needed to figure out what it actually was. She packed 2 suitcases, not because she couldn't bring more. She had a walk-in closet that could outfit a small boutique, but because walking into his house with 17 bags felt like arriving at a siege with a white flag. 2 suitcases, clothes, laptop, a small leather notebook she'd been keeping since she was 12, and the framed photograph of her mother that lived on her nightstand. That was all. Nadia found her at 10:30, sitting on the floor of her bedroom with the suitcases closed beside her. "Tell me you're not actually going," Nadia said. "I'm actually going." Elora. Nadia sat down on the floor across from her, which was something she hadn't done since they were teenagers. Her eyes were red. She'd been crying somewhere private, which was very Nadia. She cried alone and then showed up looking like she hadn't. This is insane. This is you can't just marry someone because Dad owes them money. Dad owes him $1.3 billion. That doesn't make it okay. No, Alara said. It doesn't. She looked at her sister. But somebody has to make this work, Nadia. And right now, I'm the only one who has a plan. What plan? You signed a contract. I signed a contract with terms I negotiated. That's different. She paused. I need you to do something for me while I'm gone. Nadia wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. What? I need you to go through Dad's office. All of it, his physical files, his offshore account records, the ones he thinks are hidden in the foundation documents. I need to know the real timeline of when this debt started, not the story he told us, the actual numbers. Nadia stared at her. Think he lied to us. I think a $1.3 billion debt doesn't appear overnight, Alara said. And I think Dad has been very careful about what he tells us and what he doesn't. She looked at her sister steadily. I'm walking into Damien Rourke's house blind. I need you to be my eyes out here. For a long moment, Nadia was quiet. Then she said, You're actually going to try to outmaneuver him. I'm going to try to understand the situation I'm actually in, Alara said, which is not the same thing. Yet, car arrived at noon exactly, black. No plates visible from the front windows. One driver. 2 men who stood outside the vehicle and didn't speak. Harold came to the door. He looked like he hadn't slept either, which meant at least they had that in common, though for very different reasons. He tried to say something. She could see it in his face, the speech he'd prepared, the words arranged into something that was supposed to make this better. And she kissed him on the cheek and walked past him to the car before he could start. She didn't look back at the house. Not because she wasn't going to miss it. She was going to miss it deeply, in the way you miss something you're not sure you'll ever see the same way again. But looking back felt like a concession, and she had made enough of those in the last 8 hours to last her a while. The drive took 40 minutes. She watched the city change, outside the window downtown, giving way to the older residential streets, the kind of neighborhoods where the houses sat back behind high walls and the gates were always closed. Car turned into a private driveway, and when the gate rolled open, she understood for the first time the scale of what she was walking into. The estate was not a mansion. It was a compound, 3 buildings, arranged around a central courtyard, connected by covered walkways. The whole thing enclosed by walls that were tasteful enough to pass as architectural choices and solid enough to stop a truck. There was a garden that she could see from the car window, manicured and green, and beyond it, the main house, which was older than it looked, with the kind of bones that didn't get built anymore. A woman met her at the front entrance, mid-40s, efficient, with the politely impenetrable expression of someone who had seen a great many things and commented on none of them. "Miss Voss, I'm Margaret. I manage the household. Mr. Rourke asked me to show you your rooms and answer any questions about the house." She paused. "He will see you at dinner. 7 o'clock. "Thank you," Alara said. She followed Margaret through the entrance hall and up the main staircase, taking note of everything, the layout, the sight lines, where the staff moved and how many of them there were, which doors were closed and which were open. Not because she was planning anything, just because information was the only currency she currently had, and she intended to collect as much of it as possible. Her rooms were on the second floor in the east wing, large, well-appointed, a sitting room and a bedroom, and a bathroom that was bigger than her first apartment. A window that looked out over the garden. Margaret showed her where things were, answered her questions about schedules and meals and how the household functioned, and then excused herself with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this kind of thing before, which raised its own set of questions. Alara sat in the chair by the window and looked out at the garden. She thought, "I am in the house of the most dangerous man in the city. I signed a contract I negotiated myself. My father is hiding something he hasn't told me, and dinner is at 7. She thought, "Okay, start there." Damien was already at the table when she came down. He was reading something on his phone, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbows, and for a brief moment, before he registered her presence, she caught him in an unguarded instant, just a man sitting at a table, reading, with the kind of absorbed stillness that happens when someone has genuinely forgotten to perform themselves for anyone. Then he looked up, and the stillness became controlled, and the man she'd seen for 1 second was gone. "You're on time," he said. "I'm always on time." She sat down across from him. "It's one of my 3 virtues." He set his phone down. "What are the other 2? I'll let you find out." Something moved in his expression again. That thing she couldn't quite name, that was almost amusement, but more cautious than that. Picked up his wine glass. She noticed his hands, not the gesture, the hands themselves. There were scars on the knuckles of his right hand, old ones, faded to white. They hadn't come from a desk. "How are your rooms?" he said. "Fine. Larger than necessary. I can move you to something smaller if you prefer." "That's not what I said." She looked at him. "I said, larger than necessary. I'm not complaining. I'm noting it." She paused. "Why am I in the east wing?" He looked at her. "The west wing is yours," she said. "I assume." Margaret was careful not to take me anywhere near it. "The east wing has, I counted, 4 household staff rooms at the end of the corridor. That means I'm not isolated, but I'm also not adjacent to anything you consider important." She tilted her head. "What's in the west wing, Damien?" He was quiet for a moment. "My office," he said finally, "and my personal rooms. And you put me as far from both as you reasonably could, while still calling this a shared household." "Yes." She nodded. "That's honest, at least." "I try," he said, in a tone that made it unclear whether he was being sincere or ironic, and she filed that away as one of the first real things she'd learned about him. Damien Rourke used ambiguity the way other men used walls. Food arrived a quiet server, in and out. No eye contact, and they ate mostly in silence, which was its own kind of conversation. She noticed he ate without looking at his food, kept his attention on the room, on the doors, on the window. Not paranoid, habitual. The kind of vigilance that had been going on so long. It had stopped feeling like vigilance and just felt like existing. "I want to work," she said, midway through the meal. He looked at her. "I ran the Voss Foundation's investment portfolio for the last 4 years," she said. "Not nominally, actually ran it. I built the analytics framework. I managed the allocation decisions. I developed the risk models. I need something to do with my time. And sitting in a room reading books is not something I'm willing to do for 2 years." She looked at him directly. "I'm not asking you to hand me the keys to anything. I'm telling you that I have a specific skill set and I intend to use it, and I'd rather do that in a way that's useful to someone than in a way that makes me a problem." Damien put his fork down. He looked at her for a long moment, that assessing look again, the one that searched for weak points, and then he said, "There's a position in the Financial Oversight Division that's been open for 3 months. Legitimate work. Auditing, compliance, account management." A pause. "It would give you access to certain records." "Is that a test?" she said. "It's a fact," he said. "What you do with the access is up to you." She looked at him. "You're either very confident that I won't find anything useful," she said, "or you want to see what I look for. Both things can be true." She picked up her wine glass. "Then I'll take the position." He nodded and reached for his phone, and that was apparently that. She watched him over the rim of her glass and thought about the contract, and the car at noon, and the document he'd had prepared that afternoon before she'd agreed, before he'd even made the offer. "I was that sure your father would," she thought. There are things about this situation that she doesn't understand yet. There are pieces that don't fit the story she's been told. She thought, find the pieces. Figure out what they make. She thought, you have 2 years, maybe less. Don't waste them. 3 weeks into the arrangement, she found the first thing that didn't add up. It was in the financial records, the legitimate ones. The compliance files she'd been given access to through the oversight position. A series of transactions from 4 years ago routed through 3 shell companies that terminated in an account she recognized. Not because she'd seen it in Damien's records, because she'd seen it in her father's. She sat in the small office she'd been assigned one window, north-facing, a desk that had seen better decades, and looked at the account number on her screen until her eyes started to water. The money had moved from her father's private account to a holding company that she could trace with some effort to a set of operations that Damien Rourke had been targeting for the past 18 months. Not his operations, the operations of his enemies. Her father had been funding Damien's rivals. She sat back in her chair. 4 years ago, while the Voss Foundation was publicly investing in sustainable development and children's hospitals and all the things that kept the Voss name clean, Harold Voss had been quietly moving money into the underground operations that were trying to take Damien Rourke apart, which meant the debt, the $1.3 billion that had required her to sign a contract in her living room at 4 in the morning was not bad luck. It was not a cascade of poor business decisions. It was consequence. It was what happened when you funded someone's enemies and the someone found out. She thought about sitting across from Damien at dinner, about the careful way he'd offered her the position, the access, the fact that he'd had that contract prepared before he'd even walked into her house. I was that sure your father would. He knew. He had known before he arrived. The entire negotiation, the debt, the marriage, the careful terms had not been revenge, or commerce, or the impulse of a powerful man deciding he wanted something. It had been structured, deliberate. The question was why? Why take her? Why not just destroy her father outright, which he clearly had the capacity to do? Why offer a contract with renegotiation terms? Why put her in an office with access to records that pointed back to the very thing her father had done? Why? The door opened. She minimized the screen so quickly, her hand jarred the mouse, and when she looked up, it was one of the junior compliance staff, asking a routine question about a filing deadline, and she answered it with a voice that came out completely steady and waited for the door to close again before she let out a breath. She looked at the dark screen. She thought, he is either setting her up or protecting her, or both at once, and she does not yet have enough information to know which. She thought, keep going, find more. She thought, be careful who sees you looking. She did not go to Damien with what she'd found. That was the first decision, and it was made in about 4 seconds, which was roughly how long it took her to understand that walking into his office with a printed account ledger and saying, "Look what my father did," was not a surrender. It was handing him confirmation of something he already knew and watching his face to see what he'd give away, and giving away far more herself in the process. No, she kept the screen minimized. She answered the compliance question. She went to dinner at 7 and talked about the city's infrastructure bond market with a man who ran a criminal empire and apparently had opinions about municipal financing. And she did not mention a single thing she'd found. She was getting better at that, keeping her face neutral while her mind worked somewhere behind it. What she needed was more. One set of transactions was a thread, not a picture. She needed to know how deep it went, how long it had been going on, and most importantly, who else knew. The second week of the 4th month, she found out she wasn't the only one asking questions. His name was Conrad Halse, and he was Damien's head of internal security, which in practical terms meant he was the man responsible for knowing where every threat was before it materialized. He was 51, lean in the way that happened when someone had been running on adrenaline and discipline for 30 years, and their body had just adjusted to it as a baseline. He had gray eyes that moved constantly, and a voice like something scraping on concrete, and from the first week, Alara had understood that he did not like her being in the house. Not personally. She didn't think it was personal. It was professional. She was a variable he hadn't controlled for, introduced into an environment he was responsible for, and variables were what got people killed. She respected that, actually. She didn't trust it, but she respected it. What she didn't expect was finding him in the East Wing at 6:15 in the morning. She'd woken early, bad dream. The kind that evaporates the moment you open your eyes, but leaves you with a residue of unease that has no specific shape. She'd gone to the small kitchen at the end of the corridor to make coffee, and Conrad Halse had been standing at the window at the end of the hall, outside her office door, looking at something in his hand. He tucked it into his jacket when he heard her. The move was practiced, fast, but not fast enough for her, not to see the shape of it a photograph, she thought. Maybe a printed document, small enough to fold in half. "Mr. Halse," she said, because she was not going to pretend she hadn't seen him. "Miss Voss." He turned unhurried. "Early morning." "Yes." She looked at the closed office door, then at him. "Were you looking for something?" "Checking the corridor." Routine. It was not a routine corridor check. Routine corridor checks did not involve standing outside a specific door, holding a document you hid when someone approached. She looked at him for a moment, and he looked back at her, and the air between them had the particular quality of two people who both knew the other was lying, and had decided, mutually and without discussion, to continue anyway. "I'll be in the office by 8, she said. "Good morning, Miss Voss." She made her coffee and went back to her room and sat on the edge of the bed and thought about what he'd been holding and why her office, why 6:15, and whether this was something Damien had asked to do or something Conrad was running independently. That distinction mattered enormously. She started keeping different records after that, not on the office computer, on a small encrypted drive she'd bought through a legitimate tech account, purchased before she arrived, that she kept in the lining of a leather toiletry bag in her bathroom. Old habit. Her mother had always said, keep the things that matter where someone would have to really want to find them. The records she kept were not dramatic. They were timestamps, movements, small inconsistencies in the household's routine that accumulated, over time, into a pattern. Conrad Halse checked her office 3 times in the first week after she caught him. Always early morning, always when the corridor was empty. He never went inside. She'd set a small tell on the door handle, a piece of tape barely visible under the frame, but he stood outside it each time for between 4 and 7 minutes. She did not know yet what he was looking for, but the fact that he was looking without Damien's knowledge, she thought without Damien's knowledge, she was not certain meant there were currents moving through this household that she had not mapped yet. She worked faster. The financial records were extensive, and legitimate access only opened so many doors. But Alara had spent 4 years building data models for the Voss Foundation, and data models, at their core, were about finding the connections between things that were not supposed to be visibly connected. She built a shadow framework in her head, no files, no printouts, nothing that could be found, and she began to trace the money the way she would have traced a portfolio anomaly, backward from the endpoint, always backward. By the end of the 4th month, she had the shape of it. Her father had not acted alone. The transfers to Damien's rivals, the ones she'd found first, were large, organized, the kind of movement that required infrastructure, legal cover, holding companies, cutouts, with legitimate business fronts. That infrastructure did not belong to Harold Voss. Her father was many things, and most of them were worse than she'd understood until recently. But he was not a man with an underground network. He was a man with money and a willingness to use it badly. Someone had given him the network. Someone had handed Harold Voss the mechanisms for moving that money in ways that were difficult to trace, and pointed him at Damien's rivals, and presumably told him what to fund and when. She sat in her office on a Thursday afternoon in the 5th month of her marriage and looked at the wall and thought her father had been used. He'd thought he was making a power play, probably thought he was getting ahead of a threat or building leverage or whatever story he'd told himself, and someone had handed him exactly enough rope to hang himself with, which meant the debt was manufactured. The whole thing. Someone had engineered Harold Voss's destruction, and they had done it specifically to produce this outcome. Alara Voss, inside Damien Rourke's compound, married to the man with access to his financial records. She was a plant, possibly without her own knowledge, possibly without her father's. The thought sat in her chest like something swallowed wrong. She was still sitting with it 40 minutes later when her phone buzzed. Not her regular phone, the secondary one that Nadia used to reach her. Through a routing system her sister had set up with the help of a college friend who worked in network security. The message said, "Found something in Dad's files. Can't send it. Need to talk. Is Tuesday possible?" Alara typed back Tuesday, the usual window. She put the phone away and looked at the wall again. Her hands, she noticed, were not shaking. She was not sure whether to be reassured by that or disturbed. Damien found her in the garden that evening. She'd gone out after dinner, something she'd started doing in the 3rd month, because the garden was the one space in the compound where she could think without the feeling of walls. He came out 20 minutes after her, which she'd noticed was his pattern. He did not follow immediately, gave her the time she'd gone out there to have, and then appeared. She'd started to understand that this was something between courtesy and surveillance, and she'd made peace with the ambiguity. He stood beside the low stone wall at the garden's edge and looked out at the city lights visible in the distance. "Conrad spoke to me today," he said. She kept her face toward the lights. "About what?" "He thinks you found something in the compliance files." A pause. "He thinks you've been running a secondary analysis framework." "What do you think?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the garden, cold for the season. "I think," Damien said, "that you are considerably more capable than Conrad has given you credit for, and that he is now worried about what that means." She turned to look at him. "Is he right to be?" The look on his face was difficult. Not closed, she'd gotten better at reading him over 5 months, at finding the slight variations beneath the controlled surface, but careful. The way someone looked when they were deciding how much of the truth to give. "I don't know yet," he said, and she had the specific, uncomfortable sense that he was being completely honest. "Conrad is running his own checks on me," she said, "outside of whatever you've asked him to do. Early mornings, outside my office." She watched his face. "You didn't know that." Something changed, small, quick, a tightening around his eyes that was gone in a second. "No," he said. "I'm not telling you so you'll deal with him," she said immediately. "I'm telling you because you should what's moving in your own house. And because if I'm going to survive in here, I need to understand the difference between the threats you know about and the ones you don't." Damien looked at her for a long moment. "You've been mapping the household," he said. "I've been paying attention," she said. "There's a difference." He almost laughed. It didn't make it out. Stopped somewhere in the chest, she thought, but it was close. She'd seen it happen twice before, and it always had the quality of something that surprised him as much as it surprised her. "The families that are trying to take my territory," he said, after a moment. There are 3 of them, currently coordinated. They've been coordinated for about 8 months. He looked at the city lights. What they're looking for is a weakness, something internal, a crack in the organization they can push on. He paused. Conrad has been my head of security for 11 years. He's not a traitor, but he is a man who is very afraid of being the person who let something through, and that fear has started making him act outside his brief. And me walking in the door made the fear worse, she said. Yes, because you brought me here without telling him why. Damien was quiet. Why did you bring me here, she said. Not the contract terms, not the debt, the actual reason. She'd been building toward this question for 5 months, and she asked it now, in the garden, in the cold, because she'd read enough of the financial records to know that if she waited much longer, she would already have the answer, and she wanted to hear it from him first. He looked at her. There are people who wanted your family destroyed, he said. Not just financially, completely. You, your sister, your father. There was a plan in motion that the debt was only one piece of. He stopped, and then kept going, which felt like it cost him something. Getting you inside this house was the fastest way to put you somewhere. Those people couldn't reach you without going through me. Stared at him. You used a marriage contract as protective custody, she said. I used the mechanism that was available to me. His voice was flat, but not defensive. Just stating it. Your father owed the debt. The debt gave me the legal standing to make the offer without it looking like you were protecting me, she said. He didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. She thought about the contract, the terms she'd negotiated. Clause he'd resisted on the one that had paused him just long enough for her to know it mattered. She went back to it now in her memory and looked at it differently, and understood, with the cold clarity of something finally snapping into focus, that the clause she'd pushed on was the one that gave her the right to leave the compound independently. He'd resisted it, not because he wanted to control her movements, but because independent movement was the thing that put her back in reach. She had negotiated herself a vulnerability, and he had agreed to it because she'd pushed, and he'd made the calculation that her trust was worth more than the risk. Who are they, she said. Not tonight, he said. Damien. Not tonight, his voice didn't rise, but it stopped the conversation with the finality of a closed door. There are things I need to confirm before I tell you. And there are things I need you to not know yet, because the less you know, the less Conrad thinks you're a threat. And right now, Conrad needs to believe you're not a threat. She looked at him. You're using me as a distraction. I'm protecting you, he said. Those aren't always different things. Turned away from him and looked at the city lights. Her chest was doing something complicated anger because she had spent 5 months building a picture from fragments, and he'd had the full image the entire time, and relief, because at least the picture made sense now, and something else underneath both of those that she didn't want to look at yet. Conrad is going outside his brief, she said carefully, and someone outside this house has found a way to talk to him. I know, Damien said. Then we don't have as much time as you thought. A pause. No, he said, we don't. The call from Nadia came the following Tuesday, during the 40-minute window in the early afternoon, when Alara was alone in the East Wing, without staff in the corridor. Her sister's voice was different, tighter. She'd found the records. Alara had asked for the real ones. The ones Harold had buried in subsidiary documents and foundation filings, and what she'd found had taken her 2 weeks to process before she could talk about it, without her voice doing the thing it was doing now. Dad has been moving money for longer than you think, Nadia said. Not 4 years. 7. Alara sat down on the floor of her room. 7 years ago, she said. Mom was still alive. Yes. Does he know you found this? No, Alara. The accounts he was funding, I cross-referenced them. 2 of them match companies that I found in a list I got from. Nadia stopped. I need you to understand that this part scared me. Okay? This part genuinely scared me. Tell me. The companies are registered to a holding structure that belongs to a man named Victor Crane. A beat. He's not underground. He's legitimate. He's completely legitimate on the surface. He has a foundation. He sits on civic boards. He was on the governor's transition committee 2 years ago. Nadia's voice dropped. And he has been, based on what I found in Dad's records, directing every single one of those transfers. Dad thought he was acting independently. Dad thought Crane was just a business connection who helped him structure the moves. Alara's mouth was dry. Nadia, she said. Victor Crane. Yes. Crane sits on the board of the Harlow Group. Silence on the other end. The Harlow Group, Nadia said slowly. That's Damien's primary legitimate business holding, Alara said. It's the shell he uses for above-ground operations. She pressed her fingers against her forehead. Victor Crane has been sitting on the board of Damien's own company. The silence stretched. He's inside, Nadia said. He's been inside for years, Alara said. And he used Dad to fund the rivals from the outside, while he worked the inside from a board seat. She stood up from the floor. Nadia, listen to me. Don't tell anyone what you found. Delete your search history. Not just clear it, actually delete it. Use the tool I set up on your machine. And don't contact me again until I reach out first. Alara, are you? I'm fine. She was not sure that was true, but it was what she said. Trust me. Please. She ended the call and stood in the center of her room with the phone in her hand and thought about Conrad Hall standing outside her office door at 6:15 in the morning with something tucked into his jacket. She thought about Damien saying, "There are things I need you to not know yet." She thought about the fact that Victor Crane had a board seat, that he attended quarterly meetings, that he had access to financial reporting and organizational structure, and, if he was careful about it, the kind of internal communication that would tell him exactly what Damien knew and when he'd learned it. She thought about the fact that Damien had brought her here to protect her, and that she had just become, without either of them planning for it, the only person in this compound who had connected all the pieces. She thought she needed to tell him, now. Not carefully, not after she'd organized the information, not after she'd made sure of one more thing. Now she was 3 steps from the door when it opened. Conrad Hall stood in the frame. And behind him were 2 men she didn't recognize, and the look on his face was the look of a man who had just made his decision he wasn't going to be able to walk back from. "Miss Voss," he said, "I need you to come with me." She looked at him. She looked at the 2 men. She looked at the phone in her hand, and at Conrad's eyes and at the careful blankness of his face that was performing calm over something that was not calm at all. "Where's Damien?" she said. "Mr. Rourke has been called away," Conrad said. "There was an incident at the Harlow Group building downtown. He left 40 minutes ago." A pause. "I need you to come with me now." She looked at him for 3 more seconds, long enough to understand what was happening, and to understand that she had no good options, and one less bad one, which was to go with him and stay alive, long enough for Damien to come back, and for the truth to reach him, before Conrad could ensure it didn't. Put the phone in her pocket and walked toward the door. "All right," she said, and her voice didn't shake at all, which was either a very good sign or evidence that she had gone somewhere past fear into a kind of clarity that only arrived when the choices ran out. They took her to the West Wing. That was the first thing she noted, not the basement, not outside, not a vehicle. The West Wing, which meant Conrad was not removing her from the compound. He was repositioning her inside it, which told her 2 things simultaneously. He hadn't decided yet what to do with her, and whatever was happening, he needed it to stay contained within Damien's walls. That was either better or worse than being driven somewhere, and she hadn't yet determined which. The room they put her in was not a cell. It was an office, real furniture, a window with actual glass, a bookcase with actual books. Kind of room that said, "You are being held, but we are being civilized about it," which was its own specific type of threat. One of the 2 men Conrad had brought stood outside the door. The other had disappeared somewhere down the corridor. Conrad himself came in and closed the door and stood with his back against it and looked at her with the expression of a man who had prepared several versions of this conversation and was deciding in real time which one to use. Alara sat down without being invited to and put her hands flat on her knees and waited. "What do you know about the Harlow Group?" Conrad said. "It's a legitimate holding company," she said. "I've reviewed the compliance filings. There's nothing irregular in the accounts I have access to." "That's not what I asked." "Yes, it is," she said. "You asked what I know about it. That's what I know about it. If you're asking whether I've found something irregular, you should ask that directly." Conrad's jaw tightened. He crossed the room and sat in the chair across from her, not comfortably, at the edge, with the posture of a man keeping himself from leaning forward by effort. His eyes were doing that constant movement she'd catalogued months ago, but it was faster now, more compressed. "Someone inside this compound has been passing information to Victor Crane," he said. Ilara kept her face completely neutral. "I'm aware of Crane's name," she said. "He's on the Harlow board." "He's not just on the board." Conrad watched her face the way she watched his. "He's been coordinating intelligence for the 3 families trying to take Damien's territory. Everything they know about our operations locations, schedules, financial routing, personnel, it's come from inside this compound. And it's been going through Crane." "When did you find this out?" she said. "Tonight. 40 minutes ago, same time Damien was called to the Harlow building, which was not an incident." His voice went flat. The call was fabricated. "Someone inside our own communications pulled Damien out of this house on a false alarm." The air in the room changed. "You think it's me," she said. "I think you arrived 6 months ago, with a motive I never fully bought," Conrad said. "I think you've been running an analysis framework on our financial records that goes significantly beyond compliance auditing. And I think the timing of tonight Damien away, you reaching out on a secondary phone, is the kind of coincidence I stopped believing in a long time ago." Ilara looked at him. She thought about Nadia's voice on the phone, about the 7 years of transfers, about Victor Crane and the board seat, and the specific, terrible clarity of understanding that the man Conrad was looking for had been sitting in quarterly meetings for years, while Damien built an empire on top of a compromised foundation. She thought about the fact that if she told Conrad what she knew, right now, the information went to a man who was conducting an unauthorized investigation of her without Damien's knowledge, and she did not yet know why. "Conrad," she said carefully, "who authorized this? Bringing me here, the men in the corridor." His expression didn't change, but something in it shifted, a micro-adjustment, a brief compression around the eyes that on another face would have been called guilt. "This is a security measure." "It is not a security measure," she said. "Security measure gets documented. A security measure gets run by the principal. You pulled me out of my room with 2 men. Damien has never introduced to me. You brought me to a part of the house I've never been in, and Damien is not here." She held his gaze. "So I'll ask again, who authorized this?" The silence stretched. Conrad stood up. He moved to the window and stood with his back to her for a moment, which was the first time since she'd known him that he'd given her his back, and that told her more than anything he'd said. "I have been working to protect this organization for 11 years, he said, not turning around. 11 years. Before Damien took over from his father, through the transition, through every war we have ever been in. I have never made a move that wasn't in the interest of this house." "I believe you," she said. He turned around. His face was complicated in a way she hadn't seen before, not hostile, not calculating. Tired, the kind of tired that settled into the bones of people who had been carrying weight for a very long time. "There is something I have to show you," he said, "and I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you is not a threat. It is information. What you do with it determines what happens next." He reached into his jacket, the same motion she'd seen at 6:15 in the morning in the corridor, and produced a folded document. He set it on the desk between them. She looked at it. Then she unfolded it. It took her 11 seconds to understand what she was reading. She knew because she counted them afterward, in the reconstruction. 11 seconds to read the words, and then another 5 to accept that the words said what they said, and then a very long moment of complete stillness while her mind tried to find the error and couldn't. It was a contract. Not her contract. Not the marriage agreement she'd signed at 4:47 in the morning in her living room. This was older, the paper stock different, the formatting different, and it bore her father's signature at the bottom. And Damien Rourke's, and a date that was 7 years ago. She read it twice. The agreement was explicit. Harold Voss would provide financial infrastructure and access to his network of legitimate business contacts. In exchange, Damien Rourke would provide protection for the Voss family assets against a specific threat identified in the document as a coordinated effort by 3 unnamed parties to dismantle both organizations simultaneously. The arrangement was to run for a minimum of 5 years. There was a clause on the third page that outlined contingency terms in the event that the primary arrangement was compromised. Contingency clause specified a secondary mechanism for maintaining Voss family protection. The secondary mechanism was marriage. Alara set the document down on the desk. She felt very cold and very still, the way she'd felt in the first seconds of reading it, except now the stillness had a different quality, not shock. She'd moved through shock in those 11 seconds. This was something on the other side of it, a kind of absolute clarity that arrived when every possible, comfortable interpretation had been stripped away. Her father had known about this arrangement for 7 years. The debt was not an accident. The debt was not the result of Harold Voss making bad decisions or being manipulated blindly into funding Damien's rivals. The debt was a structured mechanism, something agreed to between her father and Damien years before she had ever been in a room with either of them, and the marriage was the contingency. Fallback, the thing that was always there waiting, if the first structure broke. "He sold me," she said. Her voice came out completely flat. "It's more complicated than—" "He sold me 7 years ago," she said. "Before I knew any of this existed. He sat across from Damien Rourke, and he put my name in a contract as collateral." She looked at Conrad. "Did he tell my mother?" Conrad was quiet for 1 second too long. "She was alive 7 years ago," Alara said. "I don't know what your father told her," Conrad said carefully. "I was not present for those conversations." She stood up. She needed to stand up. Sitting was not something she could do with this in her chest. She moved to the window and put one hand on the frame and looked out at the garden, the same garden she stood in with Damien in the evenings, and tried to locate somewhere inside herself the thing that was going to tell her what to do next. Her father had told her the debt was a collapse, had stood in his robe at the bottom of the stairs and looked wrecked, genuinely wrecked, while Damien sat in the living room, and she came downstairs and negotiated terms. She thought she was choosing for herself. He had let her believe she was making a decision when the decision had been made for her before she was 22 years old. She thought about all the clauses she'd pushed on, the renegotiation terms, the independent movement clause that Damien had paused on. Careful negotiation she'd been so quietly proud of. None of it had mattered. The marriage was always the destination. "Why are you showing me this?" she said without turning around. Conrad was quiet long enough that she turned to look at him. "Because Damien doesn't know I have it," he said. She stared at him. "I found this document 3 weeks ago," Conrad said, "in a set of files that were passed to me anonymously. Someone wanted me to find it." He held her gaze. "Someone wanted me to find it and question whether Damien's attachment to protecting your family was personal enough to compromise his judgment." The room was very quiet. "Victor Crane," she said. "I think so. Yes, he fed you the document. He fed me the document, knowing I would do exactly what I've done, investigate you, pull you out of your room, keep you away from Damien while the situation at the Harlow building played out." Conrad's voice had lost its hardness. What was underneath was not soft, but it was honest. "I walked into it. 11 years in this organization, and I walked into it like a first-year operative." She looked at him for a long moment. "What's actually happening at the Harlow building?" she said. "I don't know." Damien went with 4 men. His communications have been dark for 22 minutes. Conrad checked his watch, a quick, involuntary movement. "That is 9 minutes longer than any check-in gap we've ever had." She felt the cold again, but differently this time. Not the stillness of shock, the alertness of someone who understood that the window was very small and getting smaller. "Crane didn't send Damien to the Harlow building to embarrass him," she said. "He sent him there because he needed him away from here for a specific amount of time, which means whatever is happening at the building is a component, not the event itself." She looked at Conrad. Where would Crane want Damien to be if the real operation was somewhere else? Conrad's face changed. "The Eastern accounts," he said. "The routing structure for the organization's operating capital. It's managed from a secondary facility, not this compound, not the Harlow building." He was already moving. "If someone reset the authentication protocols while Damien was dark, they could drain it," she said, "or they could freeze it. Either way, by the time Damien got back and was reachable, the window would be closed, and the damage would be done." Conrad stopped at the door. He looked at her. "I owe you an apology," he said. "Later," she said. Right now I need a phone that Crane's people aren't monitoring, and I need you to reach Damien before he surfaces from that building and gets handed whatever version of events Crane has prepared for him." "What do you know?" Conrad said. "How much?" "Enough," she said. "Crane has been on your board for years. He coordinated the funding through my father from the outside, while he fed intelligence from the inside. He built the three-family coalition. He manufactured the debt timeline. And he specifically arranged for me to be in this compound because someone needed a variable inside your walls that your people would be watching instead of him." She met his eyes. I was the distraction. He was counting on me being the distraction. And it worked for 6 months. Conrad looked at her for 3 seconds. Then he opened the door and said something to the man in the corridor, and the man disappeared. And Conrad stepped back into the room and said, "I have a secure line in the room at the end of this wing. Come with me." She followed him. The secure line was a physical phone, hardwired, the kind of redundancy that existed in organizations that had learned, usually expensively, to maintain systems that couldn't be digitally intercepted. Conrad dialed a number from memory. It rang 4 times. On the 5th ring, Damien picked up. "I've been trying to reach you," Damien said, and his voice had something in it she'd never heard before, not fear. But its functional cousin, the particular edge that appeared when someone was running calculations at speed and not liking the results. "I know," Conrad said. "I need you to listen to me. The building is a decoy. The Eastern accounts are the target. And there is something you need to know about Victor Crane." A pause. "I'm listening," Damien said. Conrad handed the phone to her. She took it, and for a moment she just held it against her ear and breathed. Because there were things she'd been prepared to say and things she hadn't been prepared for, and the sound of his voice tight with the strain of 22 minutes of dark communications, and a situation and unraveling in real time landed somewhere in her chest that she hadn't cleared space for. "It's Alara," she said. Another pause, shorter. "Are you safe?" he said. "Yes. Listen to me. Victor Crane has been running a 2-sided operation, external funding through my father's accounts, internal intelligence through his board seat at Harlow. He's been building this for at least 7 years. Tonight he created a communications blackout, sent you to a controlled location, and simultaneously activated a secondary objective at the Eastern Accounts facility." She kept her voice even. "He also fed Conrad a document designed to make Conrad doubt your judgment and isolate me from the compound's internal communication. Conrad found it 3 weeks ago." Silence on the line. "Damien," she said, "the 3 families he's been coordinating, they're not the primary threat. They're the noise. They're what you're supposed to be fighting, while Crane moves the real pieces." "What's the real piece?" Damien said. She took a breath. "There's a contingency document," she said, "with your signature and my father's. 7 years old." She paused. "I've seen it. We need to talk about it. But not now. Right now, I need you to get your people to the Eastern Accounts facility. And I need you to pull Crane's access to the Harlow systems before he realizes Conrad is no longer running point on the operation he designed." A very long silence. "Alara." His voice had changed. Something had gone out of the control in it, not collapsed, but shifted. The way a wall shifted when something on the other side of it moved. "We will talk about the document. I know. All of it." "I know," she said again. "Go, fix the accounts. Then come back here." The line went quiet for a moment, and then she heard him give a series of instructions to someone on, his end clipped, precise, no wasted syllables. And then he came back and said, "I'll be there in 30 minutes. "I'll be here," she said. She handed the phone back to Conrad. He took it and looked at her with an expression. She couldn't fully categorize, something between respect and something rawer than that. The look of a man who'd been in the same building as a specific kind of courage and recognized it without being entirely comfortable with what it asked of him. "He's going to want to know how you put it together," Conrad said. "I know," she said. "Some of what you found, the analysis you've been running, it's going to raise questions about whether you were investigating the organization." "I was investigating the organization," she said simply. "I was investigating it because I didn't know whose side anyone was on, and I needed to understand what I was inside of." She looked at him. "Including you." He didn't flinch. She gave him credit for that. "Including me," he agreed. She walked back to the window and stood there. The garden was dark outside. the lights of the city somewhere in the distance, and she was aware of a specific kind of exhaustion that wasn't physical, the kind that arrived when you'd been running at full tension for an extended period, and something had just fractured, not resolved, and the tension had changed shape rather than released. She thought about her father, about the document with his signature, about the particular betrayal of a lie that had started before you were old enough to know you were being positioned. She thought about what she was going to say to Damien when he came back. Not the operational part. The operational part was almost easier. Here is what I found. Here is what it means. Here is the sequence. She'd been building to that conversation for months, and she had the information organized. The other part, the document, the fact that he had known, always, exactly where this was going. That the man who had looked at her across a dinner table and asked careful questions and given her access to financial records and stood beside her in the garden, in the cold that man had possessed for the entirety of their acquaintance, a piece of paper with her name written into it years before she walked into his house. She did not know yet whether she was going to be able to separate that from everything else. She did not know yet whether she wanted to. The door opened behind her, and Margaret, steady, unflappable Margaret, who had been running this household through whatever was happening tonight without anyone telling her what it was, appeared in the frame with 2 cups of coffee and the expression of a coffee in this woman who had been in this business long enough to know when. People needed something practical more than they needed comfort. Mr. Rourke is on his way back, Margaret said. 30 minutes. I know, Alara said. You should eat something. I'm not hungry. You should eat something anyway. Margaret set the coffee down on the desk and looked at her with the blunt directness of someone who was not paid to manage her emotions. Sit down, Miss Voss. You're going to need to be sharp when he gets here, and you're burning through it standing at that window. Alara looked at her. Then she sat down, because Margaret was right, and because the ability to take good advice from unexpected sources was one of the things she'd learned in the last 6 months, along with how to read financial records under time pressure and how to keep her voice flat when her hands wanted to shake. She drank the coffee. She organized the information in her head into the sequence she would present it in. She thought about the document and she set it aside, not away, just aside, into the part of her mind that was capable of holding difficult things while other things got handled. She thought 30 minutes, she thought. When Damien Rourke walked back through that door, nothing in their arrangement was going to be what it had been. She thought she needed to decide, before he arrived, which version of herself was going to be in the room with him. The woman who had been used as a piece on a board she didn't know existed, or the woman who had mapped the board anyway and was still standing. She finished the coffee. She chose the second one because the first one had nowhere to go from here, and she was not done. Damien came back in 28 minutes. She heard the cars before she heard anything else. 2 of them. Moving fast through the gate, the sound of doors and men, and the particular controlled urgency of a situation that had not resolved, but had been temporarily contained. She was still in the West Wing office. The coffee cup empty, Margaret gone, Conrad at the door of the room, making calls in a low voice that she'd stopped trying to parse 10 minutes ago. Then footsteps in the corridor. Fast, but not running the walk of a man who was furious in managing it. The door opened. Damien Rourke looked like the last 3 hours had happened to him, physically. His jacket was gone. His shirt was pulled at the collar, 1 button missing at the throat. There was a cut above his left eyebrow, not deep, but fresh, the kind that came from something thrown or broken in close quarters, and a darkness around his jaw that wasn't. He looked at her for 2 full seconds before he looked at Conrad, which told her something about the order his mind had put things in, and she filed it away without letting it mean too much. Clear the room, he said. Conrad left without a word. The man from the corridor went with him. The door closed. Damien stayed where he was for a moment, breathing not ragged, but she could see the effort of the control, in the set of his shoulders, in the line of his jaw. Then he crossed the room and sat down across from her, in the chair Conrad had vacated, and put both forearms on the desk and looked at her. Tell me everything, he said, from the beginning. Not the operational summary. Everything. So she told him. She told him about the first account number she'd recognized in the compliance files. She told him about Conrad in the corridor at 6:15 and the encrypted drive, the timestamps she'd been keeping for months. She told him about Nadia's call, about Victor Crane, and the 7 years of transfers, and the holding structure that connected her father's money to Damien's rivals. She told him about the board seat and the two-sided operation, and the way Crane had used the three-family coalition as interference while run the real play through legitimate infrastructure. She told him all of it without stopping, in the precise organized sequence she'd constructed while she drank Margaret's coffee. And when she was done, she put her hands flat on the desk and looked at him and waited. Damien hadn't moved. He'd listened the way he did everything, with an absolute stillness that was not passivity, but focus, the kind of concentrated attention that missed nothing and processed everything in real time. The cut above his eyebrow had started to dry. "The Eastern accounts," he said. "Get there in time?" "We got there." Something moved across his face. Crane's people had already begun the authentication reset. "We stopped at 40% through the process. We lost access to 2 subsidiary routing accounts recoverable, but it will take time." A pause. He wasn't trying to drain us. He was trying to freeze us. Lock the operating capital, so the 3 families could move on our territory while we were financially immobilized. How long would the freeze have lasted? Long enough. His eyes went to the document on the desk. She'd left it there, visible, because there was no version of this conversation that didn't include it. He looked at it for a moment, and something in his face went through a change she watched without being able to stop. "You read it?" "Yes. All of it," she said. He reached out and picked it up. He didn't unfold it, just held it, looking at the outside of it, and she had the sense that he was deciding something, not whether to tell her the truth. She didn't think it was that, but how to begin. "Your father came to me," he said, 7 years ago. He knew about Crane, not what Crane was, not the full picture, but he'd found enough to know that someone was moving against both of our families simultaneously. He set the document down. He was scared. He'd never dealt with anything like this, and he was scared. And he came to me because I was the only person he knew who had the capacity to do something about it. He looked at her directly. The arrangement in that document was his idea, not mine. She looked at him. "He suggested the contingency clause," Damien said. "The marriage provision. I objected to it. I told him it was unnecessary, that we could structure the protection without it." His jaw tightened. He insisted. He said he needed something his word binding, something that Crane couldn't dissolve if Harold tried to renegotiate. "He used me as a lock," she said. "He used you as a guarantee," Damien said, and the distinction was technical, and she understood it, and it didn't make it better. "I want you to understand that I did not walk into your house 6 months ago with the intention of activating a 7-year-old contingency clause. The primary arrangement was intact until 8 months ago when Crane began accelerating his operation, and Harold's transfers to the rival accounts were discovered by my financial team." "You discovered the transfers," she said. "Yes. And you assumed my father had turned." It looked like he had turned. His voice went flat in the way that happened when he was working to keep it from doing something else. "The transfers were structured to look exactly like voluntary defection. I spent 3 months investigating before I came to your house. And when you came," she said slowly, "you had concluded that he hadn't turned voluntarily." "I had concluded that he was being handled," Damien said. "That someone had given him the infrastructure and pointed him at my rivals and convinced him it was his own idea." He looked at her. The same way Crane gave Conrad that document and let him convince himself he'd reached his own conclusions. The room was quiet. She thought about her father in his robe at the bottom of the stairs. She thought about the way his voice had cracked on Damien's name, and the way he'd tried to speak to her before she got into the car, the speech she hadn't let him start. She thought he had been trying to tell her something, not as an apology, as a warning. And she had kissed him on the cheek and walked past him, because she'd been too angry, too proud, too convinced. She was the one managing the situation to hear it. "The marriage," she said. "Coming to my house with the contract. What was the real objective?" Damien looked at her steadily. "Get you inside this compound before Crane's people moved against your family directly. Make it look like a debt collection to the outside, so it didn't signal to Crane that I knew about his operation." He paused. The debt was real. The mechanism was real. But the urgency, the specific timing, The night visit, that was because we had intelligence that Crane had authorized a move against you, specifically within the following 72 hours. Something cold moved through her. Me specifically, she said. You had been running the Foundation's investment portfolio for 4 years, he said. You had built the analytical framework. Crane had identified you as the person most likely to find the financial inconsistencies if the primary arrangement ever degraded. He wanted you removed from the board before you could put the pieces together. A beat. He didn't know you were already putting them together. She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, You should have told me. Yes, he said, no hesitation, no qualification. Just yes. 6 months ago, before I signed anything, you should have told me. Yes, he said again. And there was something in it, not guilt exactly. More like the acknowledgement of a specific kind of cost that had been calculated and paid. I made a judgment that the less you knew about Crane's awareness of you, the less you would inadvertently signal to him that the situation had changed. If you'd known you were being protected, you would have behaved differently. And if you'd behaved differently, he would have known you knew, she said. Yes. She stood up. She needed to move, staying in the chair with all of this in her body was not something she could continue. She walked to the window, the same window she'd stood at an hour ago, and looked at the dark garden. I've been a piece, she said. Everyone in this, my father. You, Crane, you have all been moving me. Crane was moving you, Damien said from behind her. I was trying to keep you alive. Those aren't the same thing. They felt the same from inside them, she said. He didn't answer that, which was the right choice. There was no answer that made it better, and she had learned over 6 months that Damien Rourke understood that Damien Rourke when the correct response was silence. She turned around. His face was different now than it had been when he walked in. The operational edge was still there, the assessment and the calculation that never fully left him. She'd come to understand it was structural, the way some people's baseline was anxiety and some people's was calm. But underneath it was something she'd caught glimpses of before, in the garden, in the careful, fractional moments before he pulled the control back into place. Something that was not the Mafia King who had walked into her living room uninvited at 2 a.m. Something that was tired and strained and not fully armored. Victor Crane, she said. What's your plan? He looked at her. We move tonight. The Eastern Accounts freeze attempt will have told him his timeline is compromised. He'll accelerate whatever phase comes next. What comes next? He activates the 3 families for a coordinated territorial move. Simultaneously, files a series of regulatory complaints against the Harlow Group's legitimate holdings. He has the board access to fabricate the documentation and attempts to use the legal and physical pressure simultaneously to force a collapse. Damien stood up. He's done this before. To 2 other organizations in the last decade. It's his pattern. Infiltrate, manufacture financial vulnerability, coordinate external pressure, apply legal cover, watch the structure fall from inside. He's never done it to you before. No, Damien said, because I didn't have someone inside my own compliance operation who could find the financial thread before he will fence Britchern he was ready to pull it. She looked at him. You need the financial documentation, she said. The transfers through my father's accounts, the full 7-year chain. Can reconstruct it. I have the analytical framework in my head, and I know which records to pull and in what order. If you want to preemptively file against Crane before he files against Harlow, I can build the evidentiary package. How long, Damien said. 4 hours if I have full access. 6 if I have to work around the access restrictions. You'll have full access. He held her gaze. Ilara, if you do this, I know, she said. I know what it means. I'm inside this now, regardless of what I do next. And standing at the window isn't going to make it safer. So let me do the thing I'm actually capable of doing. Something moved across his face. The same something she'd seen in the garden, in the fractional moments. He crossed the room in 3 steps and she didn't move, didn't step back, held her ground and looked at him directly as he stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the dried cut above his eyebrow and the exhaustion in the lines around his eyes. I'm going to need you to trust me, he said, knowing everything you now know. I understand that's a significant thing to ask. You should have asked 6 months ago, she said. But yes, I'm choosing to anyway. He looked at her for a moment that lasted longer than it was supposed to, And then he stepped back, and the moment closed, and they were both back in operational mode, which was the only mode either of them currently had room for. "Conrad," Damien said. And the door opened like Conrad had been precisely 2 inches from it on the other side. "Move Miss Voss to the primary financial terminal," Damien said. "Full clearance. And get me a line to the Harlow Group's legal director. I need the regulatory preemption filing started within the hour." Conrad looked at her. Something in his face had rearranged itself over the last 40 minutes into something that was not quite an apology, but was adjacent to one. "This way," he said. She followed him, and Damien fell into step beside her rather than behind her, and the three of them moved through the West Wing in the specific silence of people, with too much to do and not enough time, which was its own language, and she had become fluent in it. Primary Financial Terminal was in a room she hadn't been in before, deeper in the West Wing, behind a door that required Damien's print and a rotating code. Inside were 3 workstations, 2 screens each, and a server rack that hummed with the particular frequency of something that processed a great deal of money very quickly. She sat down. She pulled up the account architecture. She began one. The work was the thing she was best at in the world, and she went into it the way she always had, completely. The analytical part of her brain taking over while the rest of her ran on a lower current underneath, processing everything else in the background. The financial thread was there, exactly where she'd known it would be. A 7-year chain of transfers, fragmented across shell structures designed to be difficult to follow, but Crane had made the same mistake most architects of complex financial systems eventually made. He'd reused infrastructure. The same holding company appeared in 3 different transfer chains in years 2 and 5 and 6, which meant they could be connected, which meant the whole structure could be mapped from that single repeated point outward. She mapped it. Damien stood behind her for the first hour, watching the screen, occasionally asking a question that was precise enough to tell her he understood what she was doing at a level that surprised her. "You have a finance background," she said without turning around. "My father believed that understanding money was more important than understanding violence," Damien said. "He was right about that, if not about much else." "The holding company in year 5, she said. "It's also in your Harlow records. Buried in a quarterly report from 3 years ago, one line looks like a vendor payment." "Crane put his own infrastructure inside our legitimate reporting," Damien said. "Yes, which means when your legal team files the preemption, they have documentation that Crane used Harlow's own records to launder the connection. He built his cover inside your house, and you can prove it from your own filings." She highlighted the line. "That's the case, right there." Behind her, Damien was quiet for a moment. "That's the case," he said. 2 hours in, Conrad appeared at the door. "We have a problem," he said, and his voice had the specific flatness of someone delivering information they would have very much preferred not to have. Damien turned. "Crane is not in the city," Conrad said. "We've been tracking his movements since the Eastern Accounts attempt. He left New York 6 hours ago. Private flight, filed a flight plan to Montreal, but we have eyes at Dorval and he didn't land there." A pause. "He's gone dark." The room was very still. "He burned the operation," Damien said. "He may have gotten ahead of it," Conrad said. "If he knew the authentication reset was stopped, if he had a signal from someone inside, he may have activated an exit protocol. Or," Alara said without turning from the screen, "he's not running. He's repositioning." Both men looked at her. "He spent 7 years building this," she said. "He's not going to walk away from it because one component failed. A man who operates at this level of patience doesn't have one plan. He has sequential plans." She turned around. "He went dark because he's moving to the next phase, not because he's retreating. Question is what the next phase is and where it requires him to be." Damien looked at Conrad. "The 3 families," Damien said. "Where are they right now?" Conrad's face told her the answer before he spoke. 2 of the 3 leadership structures have gone dark in the last 40 minutes, Conrad said. "Same time as Crane. We can't locate the principals." Alara stood up from the terminal. "He's not filing regulatory complaints," she said. That was the plan before the Eastern accounts failed. He's cut to the contingency, and the contingency is physical. She looked at Damien. He's coordinating a direct move. Tonight. Before the preemption filing can go through, before the financial documentation is complete, before you have time to shore up the gaps. She held his eyes. He needs this resolved tonight because if it goes past tonight, he loses the leverage. And the way he resolves it is by removing the people who can build the evidentiary case against him. The silence in the room had a different quality now. How many people can build that case? Damien said slowly. She looked at him. Right now, she said, at this level of completion. 2. You, because you have the organizational knowledge. And me, because I have the analytical reconstruction in my head. She paused. He doesn't need to go through the financial architecture anymore. He just needs to get to us. Something hardened in Damien's face, not surprise, she thought, but confirmation of something he had already begun to calculate. Conrad, he said. Already moving, Conrad said, phone at his ear. Curing the perimeter. I'm pulling in the outer teams. The legal director, Damien said. The filing, I can finish the documentation from a secure terminal anywhere, Alara said. It doesn't have to be here. She was already pulling the framework onto an encrypted transfer. Tell me where we're going. Damien looked at her. The cut above his eyebrow had dried completely, and his eyes were very clear in the way that happened, under extreme pressure, in certain kinds of people not wild, not scattered, but focused down to a single bright specific point. We're not running, he said. I know, she said. I'm not suggesting we run. I'm suggesting we move to a position Crane doesn't control and finish what we're finishing. She met his eyes. He's coming here because he thinks this is where we are. If we're somewhere else when he arrives, his timeline falls apart. A moment. Then Damien said, there's a secondary location. A building in the financial district, legitimate Harlow property. Not in any of Crane's documentation. He was already moving. Conrad. Vehicle in 4 minutes. The Linden building. He stopped and looked at her one more time. And in the look was something compressed and urgent, and not entirely about tactics. Stay close to me. I've been in this house for 6 months, she said, pulling her drive and standing up. I know how to move. They went out into the corridor, and the compound was already different personnel, moving with the focused efficiency of people who'd been given clear orders, lights and patterns shifting, the house restructuring itself around a threat that was somewhere in the city, dark and moving toward them. She walked beside Damien through the entrance hall, and the night air hit her face as they went through the front doors, and she could feel her own heartbeat fast but not panicked. The rhythm of someone who had made their choice and was living inside it now, fully and without reservation. Car was there. They got in. The gate opened. And as they cleared it and the compound disappeared behind them, Conrad's phone rang, and the look that crossed his face when he answered, it landed in her chest like something dropped from a height, because she had learned in the last 6 months to read Conrad Hulse's face the way she read financial anomalies by the thing that wasn't there. And what wasn't there now was any trace of the steadiness he'd maintained through everything tonight. Talk, Conrad said into the phone. Then after a silence that lasted 4 seconds and felt like much longer. How many? He lowered the phone. He looked at Damien. They have Nadia, he said. The sound Alara made was not a word. It came from somewhere that wasn't language, a short, sharp intake of breath. That was also a sound. Involuntary, the body's response to something the mind hadn't finished processing yet. Damien's hand found her arm in the dark of the back seat and held it, not gently, firmly, with the grip of something, preventing something from falling, and his eyes went to Conrad's, and the look that passed between them was the look of 2 men recalibrating everything in real time. They're not holding her as leverage, Conrad said quietly. They're holding her as a deadline. Meaning what? Damien said, and his voice had gone somewhere very cold and very flat. Meaning Crane wants the financial documentation destroyed and the preemption filing pulled, and he wants it done before 4 a.m. Conrad checked his watch. We have 93 minutes. Alara's hand was gripping the drive in her lap, so hard the edges of it were cutting into her palm, and she could feel the cut. She focused on it because it was the thing that kept her in the present and out of the place where her sister's face was. And the distance between them was 93 minutes that felt like a wall she could see through and not cross. She looked at Damien. He looked back at her. Neither of them said what they were both calculating, because they were calculating the same thing, and they both already knew the answer. And the answer was that Victor Crane had just made the one move that changed everything. Not because it was the smartest move, but because it was the only move left that was guaranteed to work. Because she would burn everything she'd built in 4 hours to get her sister back. And Crane knew it, and Damien was looking at her face right now, and knowing it too. And the 93 minutes were already moving, and the car was still going forward into the city. And somewhere in the dark ahead of them, a man was sitting in a room with her sister and a clock, absolutely certain he had finally found the one thing that Alara Voss would not be able to think around. She didn't tell Damien to stop the car. She didn't ask Conrad to run down the location, didn't demand a phone, didn't do any of the things that the part of her that had gone cold, an animal with fear, was screaming to do. She sat in the back seat, with the drive cutting into her palm, and she breathed, one breath, another, the way you breathed when the only thing between you and a very bad decision was the ability to stay inside your own body for 30 more seconds. Then she said, "Where is she?" Conrad was already working it. His phone was against his ear, his other hand moving over a tablet with the focused speed of a man who had run extractions before and knew which questions saved time and which ones wasted it. Tracking the call signal. "Give me 2 minutes." "We don't spend 2 minutes on location," Damien said. "We spend 30 seconds. What else do we know?" The call came from a number registered to a shell company that appears in the secondary Crane documentation, the stuff Alara flagged from year 5. Conrad looked up, which means either Crane is sloppy or he wanted us to find the number. "He wanted us to find it," Alara said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "He's not hiding where she is. He wants us to know. He wants us moving toward Nadia, not toward the filing." She looked at Damien. "This is a redirect. The location is real, the deadline is real, and the choice he's giving us is real, but the entire structure of it is designed to pull us away from finishing the documentation." "I know," Damien said. "So we finished the documentation first," she said. Carr was silent for 2 seconds. "Alara," Conrad said carefully. "We finished the documentation and filed the preemption," she said. "We do that in." She looked at the time. 40 minutes, which leaves 53 minutes to get to Nadia. Her voice did not shake. She was holding it deliberately in both hands, the way you held something that would shatter if you set it down wrong. "If we go to Nadia first, the filing doesn't happen, and Crane walks. He will have used my sister to neutralize the only case that can put him away, and then he will disappear, and he will rebuild. And 2 years from now, he will do this to someone else." She swallowed. "So we finished the documentation." Damien looked at her for a long moment. "If we're wrong about the timing," he said. "I know," she said. "If Crane accelerates." She held his eyes. "I know what I'm saying. I know what I'm risking. Finish the documentation." Another silence, longer. The city moved past the windows, dark and indifferent. "Linden Building," Damien said to the driver. The Linden Building's upper floor had a terminal that Conrad's team accessed in under 4 minutes. Alara sat down, and her hands were moving before the screen finished loading, pulling the framework she'd transferred, rebuilding the interface, because they had 40 minutes, and the architecture was 90% complete. And the last 10% was the connective tissue, the specific documented links that turned a financial analysis into a legal case. Damien stood at the window and worked his phone. She could hear him behind her, low and precise, coordinating the movement of people she couldn't see toward a location. Conrad was still narrowing down. She did not look at the clock. Looking at the clock was the thing that would take her out of the work, and the work was the only place she could be right now where she was actually useful. She stayed in it completely, tracing the Year 5 holding company outward, documenting the three-point connection between Crane's shell infrastructure and the Harlow quarterly filing, building the evidentiary chain link by link with the specific care of someone who understood that a case built in 40 minutes under this kind of pressure would be examined later by people with unlimited time and no mercy for sloppiness. She did not think about Nadia. She thought about Nadia constantly, in the part of her that was running underneath the work. Her sister's voice on the phone, the way she'd said this part, scared me. The sound of someone who had found something they couldn't unknow. And she used the fear the way she'd learned to use every other difficult thing in the last 6 months as fuel rather than brake. 28 minutes in, she found the last piece. It was not where she'd expected it. It was not in the transfer chains or the shell company documentation or the board records. It was in a set of communications that Damien's legal director had pulled from the Harlow server archive internal emails, dated 3 years ago, between a Harlow administrative account and an external address that routed back, through 2 layers of obfuscation, to an account registered to one of the 3 family operations Crane had been coordinating. Crane had been communicating directly with the rival families from inside Harlow's own server, not through intermediaries, not through cutouts, directly, which meant the communication records were on Harlow's servers preserved in the archive, attributable to a board member's administrative access, clearest piece of evidence in the entire case, and it had been sitting in Harlow's own records for 3 years because no one had been looking for it. Damien, she said. He was at her shoulder before she finished the word. She showed him the screen. He read it. She watched his face go through something not shock, because Damien Rourke had apparently made a private arrangement with shock somewhere along the line that it would not appear in his face under any circumstances, but something deep and tectonic, the recognition of a betrayal that was more complete and more intimate than he'd known. He did it from inside our own building, Damien said. Not a question. 3 years ago, while you were in the room with him for quarterly meetings, she said. He was building the coalition against you from your own conference table. She paused. I know that's file it, he said. His voice was flat and very quiet. Add it to the package and file it. She filed it. The timestamp on the completed preemption filing was 2:51 a.m. She had 69 minutes. Conrad had the location. A warehouse on the west side of the Port District, registered to a logistics company that appeared once in the year 2. Transfer documentation, another piece of infrastructure Crane hadn't bothered to retire, either from arrogance or the reasonable assumption that no one would connect it in time. It was 40 minutes from the Linden building at this hour, in clean traffic. They had 69 minutes. Damien's team was already in position around the perimeter by the time the car arrived. 6 people, professionals, moving in the specific economy of motion that came from training and repetition. Conrad briefed them in 30 seconds flat. Damien took a weapon from the case in the car's trunk, checked it with the practiced efficiency of long habit, and then looked at Alara. Stay in the vehicle, he said. No, she said. His jaw tightened. Alara, she's my sister. she said. I'm not staying in the vehicle. She held his gaze. I won't get in the way of your people. I will stay behind the line. But I am not sitting in a car while Nadia is in that building. A muscle moved in his face. He didn't argue further, which she understood was not agreement, so much as the recognition that they didn't have time for it. Behind the line, he said, You stop where I tell you to stop. Yes. They moved. The warehouse was 3 stories, the kind of structure that had stopped being used for its original purpose and started being used for the kind of purposes that didn't get filed with the city. One entrance on the south side. Loading doors on the east. Conrad's team took the east. Damien and 2 others took the south. Alara followed Damien at the distance he'd indicated and kept her breathing even and her eyes moving. The south door was unlocked. That was the first thing wrong. Damien registered it. She could see it, in the way he stopped a half-second before he pushed the door, in the slight recalibration of his posture, and then he went through anyway, because there was no version of this where they didn't go through. And unlocked doors were either traps or invitations, and the only way to know which was to walk into them. The ground floor was empty. Not abandoned, there were chairs, a table, equipment that had been used recently, but no people. The kind of empty that was recent and deliberate. Second floor, one of Damien's men said quietly, and they moved toward the staircase. Halfway up, Alara smelled it, something chemical, sharp, the specific smell of electronics running hot in an enclosed space. She registered it and filed it and kept moving. The second floor landing opened into a large open space, and in the center of it, so under a single working light, were 3 things. Nadia, sitting in a chair with her hands tied in front of her, eyes open and alert and furious in the specific way that meant she was scared and refusing to show it, a man Alara didn't recognize, standing 6 feet from Nadia with a phone in his hand and the posture of someone waiting for a call, and a laptop on the table beside Nadia that was connected to something Alara's eyes cataloged automatically, a transmission setup running hot, the source of the smell. The man looked at them. He did not run, which told her he'd been expecting them. Mr. Rourke, he said with the specific courtesy of a man delivering someone else's message. Mr. Crane asked me to tell you that you're welcome to take the girl. The arrangement is concluded. Damien didn't move. Where is Crane? Gone, the man said simply. The deadline, Conrad said from behind them. He'd come up the east staircase. It was never real. The man with the phone almost smiled. The deadline was designed to produce the choice you made. Mr. Crane wanted to know whether, when it came to it, Miss Voss would protect the filing or protect her family. He looked at Alara. He needed to know your priorities. For future planning. The room went very cold. He's not gone, Alara said. He's watching. The laptop it's transmitting. He's watching this room right now. Every head turned to the laptop. He crossed the room, past Damien's outstretched arm, through the space that was supposed to be the line she didn't cross, and looked at the screen. Live feed. Outbound. And in the corner of the interface, a small chat window. And in the chat window, one line of text that had appeared in the last 30 seconds. Hello, Alara. I see you chose the filing. She stared at the screen. Then she sat down in the chair in front of it, and she looked directly into the laptop's camera, and she said, Hello, Victor. Chat window flickered. Then, impressive work tonight. The Year 5 holding company. I didn't think you'd find the communications archive. That was a genuine oversight on my part. You're not as careful as you think you are, she said. Careful people don't reuse infrastructure. Careful people also don't bet everything on a 69-minute window while their sister is in a warehouse. I didn't bet everything, she said. I finished the documentation and sent my husband's team to get my sister. Those aren't mutually exclusive. A pause in the chat window. Then your husband. A longer pause. Interesting choice of word. Where are you, Victor? Somewhere comfortable. Then, the preemption filing will be challenged. I have attorneys who have been prepared for this contingency for 2 years. Your evidentiary chain has gaps. It has 3 gaps, she said. I know exactly where they are. I left them deliberately because filling them would have taken another 40 minutes, and I didn't have 40 minutes. She held the camera's eye. But I have them now, and the filing is already in the system, which means the legal clock is running, and every hour you spend challenging it is an hour your financial records are under regulatory scrutiny. She paused. You moved money through 4 jurisdictions, Victor. The U.S. filing is the first. I've already sent the documentation package to contacts in 2 of the other 3. The chat window was still for a long time. Then, you're bluffing. I've been in this industry for 4 years, she said. I built analytical frameworks for a billion-dollar foundation. Do I seem like someone who bluffs about documentation? Another long pause. Behind her, she was aware of Damien, of Conrad, cutting the man with the phone off from the staircase, of someone crossing to Nadia and beginning to work on the restraints. Kept her eyes on the camera. This isn't finished, Crane typed. No, she agreed. But you are. She closed the laptop. The transmission died. The room was quiet for a moment, the specific quiet that followed something that had been moving very fast, suddenly stopping. Then Nadia said, from across the room, in a voice that was doing its absolute best to be steady, "Can someone please untie my hands? Because I've been sitting here for 3 hours, and I would very much like to never do that again." Alara crossed the room. She crouched in front of her sister and looked at her face, checking the automatic inventory of someone cataloging damage, and Nadia looked back at her with red-rimmed eyes, and the expression of someone who had made a private decision not to fall apart until later. Are you hurt? Alara said. No. Nadia's hands came free and she flexed them, wincing. I'm not hurt, I'm furious. Okay. I'm furious at you, specifically. I know, Alara said. You sent me into Dad's files and didn't tell me it was actually dangerous. I know, and I want to have a very long conversation about that. We will, Alara said. We'll have the whole conversation. All of it. She put one hand on the side of her sister's face briefly, and Nadia stopped talking and just looked at her, and the look between them was the look of 2 people who had been circling a very large amount of unsaid things for a very long time and had finally run out of room to keep circling. Later. Okay? Later, Nadia's jaw tightened. She nodded. Damien appeared at Alara's shoulder. He looked at Nadia with the careful assessment of someone who'd been in this line of work long enough to know that people who said they weren't hurt sometimes weren't, and sometimes were, and he said, there's a doctor at the compound. We'll have you looked at before anything else. Nadia looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Alara. Then she looked at him again and said, You're taller than I thought. Something almost moved on Damien Rourke's face. Let's go, he said. Victor Crane was arrested 11 days later. Not in the country where his flight plan had pointed, and not in the comfortable somewhere he'd implied. He was found in a serviced apartment in a city where 3 different regulatory investigations had, within the span of 8 days, requested his financial records simultaneously, and where the legal team he'd spent 2 years preparing had declined to represent him once the evidentiary chain became public, because some contingencies could not be planned for in advance, and one of them was the kind of documentation that made lawyers reassess their risk exposure. The 3 family operations lost their coordination structure within a week of Crane's arrest, because the coordination had always been Crane the money, the communication, the shared intelligence. Without him, they were 3 separate organizations with 3 separate interests, and Damien negotiated 2 of them into neutrality within the month and let the third one exhaust itself trying to move on territory it no longer had the infrastructure to hold. The Harlow Group filed a formal statement removing Victor Crane from the board, retroactively auditing his tenure and cooperating fully with the regulatory investigation. The statement was 3 paragraphs. Alara wrote 2 of them. Harold Voss was the hardest part. She drove to the estate on a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks after the warehouse, and sat across from her father in the living room, the same room. The same chairs, the same light coming through the windows that she'd sat in before the night. Everything changed. He looked smaller than he had. Not physically, Harold Voss still sat straight, still wore his clothes carefully, still had the bearing of a man who had spent decades being important. But something underneath the bearing had shifted, and what was underneath was someone who had been carrying a very specific weight for 7 years and had recently had the carrying noticed. She told him what she knew, all of it. The 7-year timeline, the transfers, the way Crane had built the infrastructure and handed it to him, the marriage clause, the contingency he'd built into the agreement without telling her. Harold listened. He did not interrupt. He did not offer explanations or justifications, which she'd been prepared for and which his absence actually made harder in a different way, because the speech she'd prepared had been built to knock down arguments. And in the absence of arguments, she was left with just the facts and the silence between them and her father's face, which was showing her something she hadn't expected. It was not guilt. It was grief, old grief. The kind that had been living in a person for years, that showed up when the thing being grieved was finally named out loud. "Your mother knew," he said when she finished. Alara went very still. Not the details, not the full arrangement. He looked at his hands. She knew I had made a deal I wasn't telling her about. She asked me twice, in the last year of her life, to tell her what it was. His voice was careful in the way of someone handling something that had been kept under pressure for a very long time. I didn't. I told her. It was resolved. I told her she didn't need to worry. He looked up. She didn't believe me. She died not believing me, and knowing I was lying, and not having any way to make me stop. The room was quiet. "She would have told you," Alara said. Not an accusation. Just a fact she was working through in real time. "Yes," her father said. "She would have." He held her eyes. "That's why I didn't tell her the details. Because I knew she would go to you, and I knew I have always known that once you understood the shape of a situation, you would walk directly into it." He paused. "I was trying to protect you from it. By putting my name in a contract before I was 22, she said. By ensuring that if the worst happened, there was a structure in place that would keep you safe." His voice didn't rise or fall. It stayed level in the way of someone who had accepted, a long time ago, that the explanation would never be enough. "I know that's not what it looks like from where you're standing. It looks like you made a decision about my life, without asking me," she said. "Yes," he said. "It does, because that's what I did." She looked at him for a long time. The anger was still there. She wasn't going to tell him it wasn't, because he knew her too well, and she respected him too little to lie to his face. But underneath the anger was something that had been loosening over the last 3 weeks, something she hadn't been able to name until she was sitting across from him, watching the grief in his face. He had been afraid. He had been afraid in the particular way of someone who saw a threat they couldn't manage through the mechanisms they understood, and he had done the thing frightened people did, which was reach for the structure that felt most solid and build the rest of the plan around it. Structure he'd reached for was Harold Voss's greatest professional skill, which was negotiation, the contract, the binding arrangement, the legally documented guarantee, and he'd applied it to his daughter the way he'd applied it to every other asset he'd spent his life protecting. That was its own kind of tragedy, and she understood it now in a way she hadn't when she was standing in this room 6 months ago, with 2 suitcases and a leather notebook, and her jaw set against looking back at the house. "I need you to do something," she said. He looked at her. "Federal investigators who are looking at Crane's operation. They're going to want testimony about the transfer structure, about how you were recruited, how the infrastructure was presented to you, who made contact and when." She held his gaze. "I need you to cooperate. Fully everything." He was quiet for a moment. "That will be complicated," he said, "for the family name. The family name already survived $1.3 billion in debt and a shotgun marriage," she said. "It'll survive the truth." Harold looked at her for another moment. Then something in his face moved, not collapsed, not broken, but gave in the way that something gives when the resistance finally costs more than the surrender. "All right," he said. She drove back to the compound in the kind of quiet that wasn't empty. There was too much in it for empty. Conversation with Damien happened on a Saturday in the garden, which had become the place where things got said that couldn't be said inside. She'd understood that about it months ago, and apparently so had he. It was late afternoon, the light going gold and horizontal, the kind of light that made the city in the distance look softer than it was. She'd been out there for 20 minutes before he came, which was his pattern, and when he appeared, he sat on the low stone wall rather than standing beside her, which was not his pattern, and told her something had changed in the way he'd decided to hold this conversation. "Crane is in federal custody," she said. "Yes. The 3 families are neutralized. For now." He looked at the city. "There will be others. There are always others." "I know." She turned to look at him. "Contract expires in 14 months. The renegotiation clause." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "I want to renegotiate it now," she said. Something moved in his face, quick, complex, the kind of thing that happened when someone had prepared for a conversation, and the conversation started somewhere unexpected. "To what terms?" he said carefully. "I don't want a contract," she said. "I want a conversation, a real one, without terms and without documented contingencies and without the structure of an arrangement built by 2 men in a room without me." She held his eyes. "I want to know you, actually, not the mechanism whether you want me here." The garden was quiet around them. A wind moved through the low plants at the wall's edge. Damien looked at her for a long time. Not the assessing look, not the calculating look. Something else, the look she'd seen fractionally, in moments, since the early months, the one that came when the control slipped just enough to show what was behind it. "I have not," he said, carefully, "wanted anything as uncomplicated as wanting in a long time." "That's not an answer," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's not." He looked at his hands for a moment, the scarred right hand, the old white marks on the knuckles. "Yes," he said, "I want you here, not the contract. You." She looked at him. The word landed the way she'd thought it would, which was to say that it landed hard, in a way that required a moment to absorb. She'd known what he'd say. She'd known from the warehouse, from the way he'd said, "Stay close to me," from months of gardens and dinners, and the carefully maintained distance that was, she'd come to understand, itself a form of respect rather than coldness. But hearing it was different from knowing it. That was always the case with the things that mattered. "The document that Conrad had," she said. 7-year contract. "I had every copy destroyed the night of the warehouse," he said. She looked at him. "Before you could tell me to," he said. She almost laughed. It didn't quite make it out, caught somewhere in the chest, in the complicated, tangled place where the last 6 months lived, but it was close. And he saw it, and something happened on his face. in response that she had never seen there before. It was unguarded, completely, briefly, unguardedly warm. Okay, she said. He looked at her. Okay, I'm staying, she said. Not on contract. I'm staying. They sat in the garden for a while after that, not talking, the city going darker in the distance, and the light shifting through its last colors. And the silence between them had the quality that silence acquired between people who had been through something very bad together and had come out. The other side changed, not healed, not clean, but changed, and choosing what to do with the change. Nadia stayed at the compound for 2 weeks after the warehouse and spent most of them asking Conrad pointed questions about security protocols that he answered with decreasing resistance, which told Elora something she filed away for later. Nadia left on a Thursday morning with a card Conrad had written something in that she didn't show Alara, and a standing invitation that Damien extended with the formality of someone who did not extend invitations lightly and meant this one seriously. Harold Voss testified to the federal investigators in a deposition that lasted 3 days. His attorney described it afterward as one of the most thorough cooperations he'd encountered in 30 years of practice. Family name took a hit. It survived, as Alara had said it would. Harold himself looked lighter after, in the specific way of people who had been holding something for a very long time and had finally been allowed to put it down. Alara took the compliance position permanently, officially, with a title and a documented role and the kind of access that no longer needed to be justified to anyone. She rebuilt the financial architecture of the legitimate Harlow operations over the following months, closing the gaps Crane had exploited, building redundancies and oversight structures that did not depend on any single person's trustworthiness. Conrad told her, approximately 4 months after the warehouse, that it was the most thorough financial security framework he had encountered in 11 years of working in environments where financial security was a matter of survival. She told him she would add it to her resume. He almost smiled. Actually, almost. There was a moment. Much later, almost a year, after the night Damien had walked into the Voss estate and sat in a chair he wasn't invited to and told her father to sit down when Alara was standing at the window of the West Wing office that was now hers, looking out at the garden in the early morning. And she thought about the woman who had come down those stairs at 2 a.m, with her hands steady and her face neutral, and her heart doing something very loud and unpleasant inside her chest. That woman had walked into a situation she didn't understand, built from pieces she wasn't given, arranged by people who had decided her future without her consent, and she had done what that woman always did. She had paid attention, and she had mapped it, and she had made herself useful in ways that mattered, and she had refused quietly, stubbornly, without speeches or declarations, to be only what someone else's plan required her to be. She thought about what it cost. It had cost things she was still accounting for, in the slow, private arithmetic that happened in the early mornings, before anyone else was awake. Her relationship with her father had been reconstructed from different materials than the one it replaced, sturdier, maybe, because it was built on what was actually true rather than what was comfortable. Her understanding of herself had been revised in ways she was still incorporating, adding them one by one to the picture, like someone completing a work that kept turning out to be larger than they'd initially measured. She thought about Damien asleep in the next room, which was still something her mind presented to her with a kind of mild disbelief, the way it noted other things that had somehow become ordinary without announcing themselves. She thought 6 months ago she had stood at the top of a staircase and looked at the back of a man's head and felt the cold click of something snapping into a place she hadn't cleared for it. Thought it was still there. It had not gone anywhere. It had, if anything, deepened into something that had more room in it and fewer edges, the way water carved stone over time into shapes that were smoother than either the water or the stone had planned. She thought she had not chosen any of the conditions that brought her here. She thought she had chosen everything since. Turned away from the window and went to make coffee, and the house was quiet around her, and the morning was coming in through the east-facing windows in the long gold lines of early light. And outside in the garden, the city was already moving, and she was part of it now in ways she hadn't been before, more complicated, more costly, and more genuinely hers. That was enough. That was she had learned what enough actually felt like.